Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on Building a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Brian Goldman. And Brian is a Canadian emergency room physician and is also host of a program called White Coat, Black Art, which is a show on the Canadian CBC radio. And he talks about the background of the medical field and behind the sliding doors, you call it, in the hospitals. And you're also author of several books. And one of them is one we want to talk about is The Power of Kindness, why empathy is essential in everyday life. And is there more you'd like to just say about by way of introducing yourself before we get started?
Sure, and thank you for that kind introduction and giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit about myself. I have been an emergency physician, an ER physician at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto for more than 30 years. We call it Sinai Health System now after it merged with a long-term care facility. And I've been a frontline emergency physician for 35 years. Wow, amazing. Yeah. Time flies. And one of the reasons why I went into emergency medicine was to have a stimulating, absorbing practice that was sufficiently part-time that I had time to write. And I built up my writing and journalism career, doing a lot of freelance work for newspapers and magazines, and eventually settling on radio as my medium. As my executive producer for television once said, Brian, you've got a great face for radio. And I'm very fortunate to have been able to host White Coat Black Art, which on the Canadian version of NPR for the last 12 years. Wow. We're now entering a new season, and we're on the full year, which means we're on from September until the end of June. And it allows me a unique window to look at the culture of modern medicine. And we explore themes that are not unique to Canada, that are certainly important in the United States, in Western medicine, as delivered in all nations. And I like to think of most of my book writing as being a reflection of that exploration of the culture of medicine. I think The Power of Kindness, as I hope you've discovered, is a little different from my other books in that it's a little bit more personal and a little bit less about healthcare and more about empathy and kindness in the world at large.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is you're going to be talking about your own personal journey more than. And what I want to do, just introduce the sort of the interview or dialogue process, is I wanted to, start off by reflecting back what I got, kind of the very basic gist of the book. And then I'm going to use active listening, also reflective listening or empathic listening, to hear what you have to say and reflect back my understanding of what I'm hearing you say until you feel completely heard, completely understood. And then you are offering too that after that you would listen to me as well and offer empathic listening for what you're hearing me say too. So we'll start off with me listening to you and then maybe turn it into a mutual empathic dialogue.
That sounds wonderful, and I've already got the impression that you have a delightful sense of curiosity, and I'm looking forward to indulging your curiosity while exploring what I've discovered about empathy and kindness.
Okay, so then I'll just start off with, so having read your book, what I heard is that, yes, you're an ER doctor, and you're really questioning your own empathy and your own sense of kindness. Are you empathic? Are you kind? And there were certain things that kind of led to that. You're getting kind of stressed and some kind of, I guess, errors or things that had happened in your work. So you're really concerned and questioning your own, your own values or your own way of being. And so you went on this sort of this personal quest to really understand, are you a kind soul? Are you an empathic soul? And you started off by, I guess you're being a physician, you're in the medical field and there's a lot of tests. So you start off by testing yourself, going out and having checking the neuroscience, having an fMRI, going to a research center to kind of see, well, are you empathic? Do you have mirror neurons, and are they lighting up, and so forth? And then you also went and did some self-assessment, someplace that does sort of empathy self-assessment exams. You tried that. And then you went and checked with kind of the other direction. Like there's the empathy direction, but then there's sort of went to the extreme opposite to check, what is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism? What's that all about? So you went kind of searching there to kind of understand that. And then you wanted to see, who are the top people in the world or the country or just anywhere who are very kind and empathic, and you wanted to go check with them. So it kind of took you on a journey around the world to really find those people, to talk to them, to learn from them and from their experience. And then you came back after all that, and then you said, then you went and kind of asked people around you, are you caring, kind, and empathic? And you asked your wife, and she said, yes, you're very caring and empathic. And so you got sort of like confirmation, and that you also said that she's the most empathic person and kind person. And so you've got this mutual sort of caring and empathic relationship. So I guess, did I hear you accurately, and is there more?
Yeah, and Edwin, one of the things about writing a book, there's a first draft. The first draft was 145,000 words, and in fact, that didn't include about another 30,000 words that I could have put into that book. I had a chapter on Schadenfreude, and that was very impersonal to me because early on in my search for experts in empathy, I discovered that a lot of them had no time for book writers. Some of them even said to me that they were told never, not to be interviewed by a book author if they're writing a book, because somehow my book and their book would be in competition with one another. And for a while, I wondered if empathy researchers were among the least empathic people on the planet. Because they weren't helping me, and I had to nod to the experts in Schadenfreude, because from the instant I spoke to them, they were generous with their time. They were glad that somebody was curious and interested in exploring, Schadenfreude, and I actually learned a very important lesson from one of them. Her name is Mina Sakara. She's a PhD psychologist. Who studied at the University of Pennsylvania, and now she's at Harvard. And she gave me the antonym of empathy, which I found fascinating. I thought, I think a lot of people would think that the opposite of empathy is meanness. That's more to do with kindness. But the antonym of empathy, she said, is apathy. And I found that, and to me, that was a very important insight. You have to, so there's a yin-yang relationship between the people you gravitate towards and the people you dislike. And it's important to remember that it's often the flip side. It's often in those relationships that where you're having difficulty with somebody that the roots of friendship actually begin.
Okay, well, let me reflect back what I'm hearing so far, just to model the empathic listening. So what I understand is, to begin with your quest, you reached out to empathy experts. And it was like they didn't even want to talk to you. They didn't seem very empathic. They didn't seem very caring and open to you. And it was perhaps you were thinking maybe because they're in competition somehow, because your book might compete with theirs or something. So that you also reached out with another community, which is sort of looking at the lack of empathy, which is the community that studies Schadenfreude. And that community was very open and inviting, and were willing and glad to talk with you. And they had an insight that you got. So it sounds like a real insight that you got was that it's not the opposite of empathy is not it's not meanness, because it's apathy. Did you say? So it's apathy, because if you're mean towards somebody, you're still sort of relating and sort of still in an engagement. And that's like, that can move into sort of a deeper empathic connection. Whereas if it's apathy, there's just this wall up, and yeah, you're not gonna, is that it? Is that kind of what you're?
You care enough about that person that you dislike to invest in disliking them, perhaps plotting revenge. That's what Schadenfreude, or fantasizing about revenge, whether you're going to do it or not. But apathy is not caring. Like, who cares, you know? And we often teach people to not care, you know, in traffic. You know, if you're cut off by somebody, the worst thing you can do is get into a road rage incident with them. It's better to say to not care about them. I don't agree. I think it's better to wonder, they must be in a hurry. Maybe they're rushing to the hospital. Maybe they're trying to save a marriage, you know, or maybe they're impaired. You know, maybe, in other words, if you come up with these other alternative explanations, well, you're actually using your empathic skills, your cognitive empathic skills. And Edwin, I learned that a long time ago personally, when I had, when I suffered from depression, and I went to a clinical psychologist named Brian Shaw, and he taught me CBT. He taught me CBT 30 years ago. And you know how, have you ever had the experience of walking by a coworker and having them kind of frown as they walk by you, and you know, people who tend to be depressed, the first thought they have is it my breath? That's the most jocular explanation. Or do they hate me? Have I done something? You know, what's wrong with me that they would frown at me? And Brian Shaw taught me the tenets of CBT, which are to pose alternate explanations. They have to run to the bathroom. They didn't even notice you. They had a fight with their spouse. They're just lost their job. There are so many other alternative explanations, alternative hypotheses, that can deliver you from the inevitable latching on to the idea that this person dislikes you. And you know, stop me when you want, but this is this is getting to empathy, because first of all, the act of cognitive behavioral therapy, alternative hypotheses, is an exercise in empathizing, cognitive empathy for the other person. The other thing that it does is it delivers you from self-preoccupation. And you cannot, in my opinion, one of the things I learned from the book is that you cannot empathize with others when you are self-preoccupied. You have to somehow be able to set that aside to start being curious about, Edwin, how you're processing what I'm saying right now.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that sort of that meanness, or that trying to understand people, even if you're finding negative explanations of it, is still moving towards empathy, because you're still trying to engage, trying to understand, try to be aware of where that person is, even if it's inaccurate, even if you make up some kind of an idea of what might be going on with them, that is moving outside of yourself, not just sitting and being preoccupied with yourself, detaching, putting up walls with other people, just being in your own world, but you're still out in the world, sort of engaging, trying to understand them, or even get pissed off at them. It's moving. It might not be empathy totally, but it's still moving in that general direction, as compared to just detaching, being inside yourself. And maybe that being inside yourself kind of just leads to depression or self-absorption or something.
Exactly. Now, Edwin, if I can, you asked a question a while back. What was not in the book, and what else did I discover that was not in the book? And the most important thing, that I had a large chapter originally on the role of shame in healthcare. There are many reasons why health professionals are not particularly empathetic. I'm getting a phone call, which I'm going to have to get rid of, and I apologize for that. Very odd.
That's fine.
I apologize for that.
Okay, let me reflect back what I was hearing up to that point. So that you're also, you'd mentioned it before, there was just a lot of material that wasn't covered in the book that you had to leave out. You have to cut out a lot. And one aspect was the Schadenfreude component, and there's another area about the nature of shame, and you're sort of looking now to talk about what your insights were there.
And the reason why it's important for me to talk about that is that people ask me, what have I learned? What did I learn about myself? And what I learned about myself is that I'm one of a kind in healthcare. There are many health professionals, I don't know how many, but probably more than we realize, who are shame prone. And I think they became, this is just my intuitive best guess, that they become emergency physicians or other healthcare providers to try to do enough good deeds to kind of keep the shame at bay. And when I say shame, I'm not talking about guilt. I'm talking about toxic shame. I'm talking about that feeling that one gets, and if you've never experienced it, then it would be an unfamiliar concept. But if I can explain it, it's that feeling of being discovered for having made an error, and sometimes the errors involve patient care, and they're serious errors. Other times they're just faux pas. They can be that trivial. But whatever it is, being caught, and the more people who discover, the worse the feeling is. When you're in that feeling of shame, it's as if you want a hole to open up in the earth and swallow you up and make you disappear. And what you fear is being discovered. And the wider the circle of people who discover you, the worse. And there's nothing worse than issuing a tweet, on a Twitter account. And I'm a public person in Canada, issuing a tweet that is viewed as racist. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Honest talk is what I'm all about. We had a town hall. Our radio show does occasionally has the show staged before a live audience, and we did a show about the people who grow up with severe emotional and physical challenges, and they have a lifelong disabilities that require care, and often require that their parents look after them well into their old age, until their adult children are in middle age. And it was a wonderful event. And we had a lawyer, we had a physician expert on a panel, and we had a young man who was a shining example of an adult who is living with disabilities, and in spite of that, has now been able to go to university with the help of 24-hour-a-day attendance. All a wonderful story. He brought his companion dog on the stage with him. So on the stage in front of 300 people. And his companion dog's name, he didn't name the dog's name is Gypsy. And after that, we received criticism from people of the Roma community for whom the word gypsy is a derogatory term. And because I said the name gypsy, I felt like as if I was responsible, and I was embarrassed, and I felt a sense of shame. And to the Roma people, calling somebody gypsy is about the worst thing you can call them. I'm a Jew, and I can talk about myself. It would be as if I'd said, here's Wesley talking, and with his companion dog, Kike. It felt like that. Now, it wasn't that severe, but I wanted to remedy it immediately. And that's part of my personality. And in that state of shame, it's very hard to empathize with other people. In my past life, 20 years ago, I would have been overly burdened by it. Instead, I met with the woman who led the accusations, and I had tea with her, and I wanted to empathize with her, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to tell me more. And in fact, she was quite pleased by that encounter, and it turned out to be a good encounter. But that's me moving forward, learning the lessons of kindness. Whereas in my former self, I probably would have avoided her, and I would have left her seething, and I would have left myself unhealed. And not able to move forward and make something positive. One of the things I've learned, you have to learn as a physician, is if you're going to, we're human, if we make mistakes, you're not going to last long if you can't find a way of dealing with those mistakes that's a little healthier than shame.
Okay, so you're addressing another sort of a block to empathy, which is shame. That in physicians, what I'm hearing is that they make mistakes and they may become ashamed of those mistakes and sort of hide it. And that when you hide those mistakes, that it opens a deep pit that you can fall into, a sort of a shame hole or shame pit. And that an example you have is that with one of the shows that you did, there was you used the word gypsy, and the Roma community just felt very insulted by that. And you could have just put up walls and tried to protect yourself, and it would be an unresolved, sort of a shame feeling that you're dealing with. But instead of just feeling shame about it, you engaged with the people that were concerned about what you were saying. You had a dialogue. You were able to move through it. So you were able to, instead of going to shame, you went into sort of empathic dialogue and empathic understanding to move out of it and to move forward.
Yes. That was exactly it. And it turned it, and it's very interesting because afterwards, the broadcaster was concerned with me that I'd taken actions without consulting with them. And I felt a brief sense of shame about that. And, I'm a physician, and physicians are trained to want to have their own sense of agency. And I don't want to have that agency taken away from me. I want to. There are times when I'm not going to wait for my managers to tell me how I should respond to something like that. I reached out to her, and perhaps I shouldn't have done anything official. Perhaps I should have simply agreed to meet with her to hear her concerns and leave the official response to the broadcaster. But I don't regret what I did at all.
Okay, so a place where a little bit of shame could have come in was with your broadcaster saying, "Hey, you shouldn't be doing this, talking on the side. We should be doing it." But you were able to speak with her and sort of work it out as well. Is that?
That's exactly it.
Okay.
And this is not a random comment or observation. If you have been a patient in a hospital these days, there's a good chance that you've had communication with physicians, with nurses, that has gone off the rails, where you're in pain, either emotional or physical pain, or you have a loved one who is perhaps dying or seriously ill, and it's almost as if the health professionals are rubbing your nose in it. There are many, many people who walk away from an encounter in the hospital saying, "What was that all about? Aren't we suffering enough? Did I have to get a snappy comment? Did I have to be yelled at for coming in? Like, I've got stage 4 cancer or stage 3 breast cancer. Did I have to be yelled at for not coming in with my lump sooner? Like, what was that all about?" And I know, because I've been an observer of the culture of medicine for a long time. It's defensive-ness. It's the health professional terrified that you're going to start accusing them. If I would say that the dominant attitude of health professionals nowadays is defensiveness. And that defensiveness comes from their terror of being caught out, making a mistake, and being shamed for it. And they'll do anything to avoid that. The problem with that is that it doesn't make healthcare safer, and it certainly is an impediment to empathy. And I didn't invent that. Brené Brown said that shame kills empathy, and it does. And so if you want to have a more empathic healthcare professional, you have to address shame in many.
Okay. So really, since you've been an observer of the whole healthcare field, you've just been observing the nature of shame, and that physicians are concerned about making any mistakes because they'll be shamed because of it, and that's creating a lot of problems of its own, as well as it creates defensiveness on the part of physicians, that they're trying to protect themselves against being shamed, and they might be sort of lashing out in a sense to patients, and patients are feeling that they're not being empathized with. They're kind of feeling the defensiveness and they're kind of the recipients of it, and they're noticing that, and that you're really wanting to create it sounds like you really would like a more effective environment where the physicians don't feel shamed, that they're able to work with empathy, that they're able to empathize with the patients, as well as, I imagine, creating what I would call a culture of empathy. So creating a mutually empathic environment that will get past these fears and defensiveness. And you're sort of like maybe wanting to show a pathway forward with empathy.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Now, that chapter ended up not being in the book, but it subsumes a great deal of the book, and it's certainly part of my personal journey. And I'm gratified to know that there are colleagues who are starting to study shame among health professionals, and it's a slow process of doing research, of doing interviews with people, typically immediately following an error or reflecting on errors that they've made in their practice, and finding out how they responded. What were they afraid of being discovered? Did they confide in anyone? What was it like to confide in that person? Did that person empathize with them by sharing, for instance, you tell me a story of when you've made a mistake, and I'll tell you a couple of mine. Or did they sit in silence and make that person who confides feel as if they're the only one in the room who's ever made a mistake? One of the big lessons that I learned by interviewing all of these amazing people is that we're all, I think, unless you're a psychopath or a narcissist or a Machiavellian, you're born with the brain equipment, with the wiring, as it were, to be empathic. But empathy at the highest levels of executive function is a choice, and it's a choice born of your mindset. Are you under stress, or do you feel like you have enough emotionally, physically, economically? Are you constantly preoccupied by some internal dialogue or internal trauma that you have to deal with, and that's where the shame comes in? Or do you have some physical challenge, such as deafness, or emotional challenge like loneliness or great disappointment in your life that preoccupies you? If you can get past that preoccupation, and I met people who did that, they discover that challenge that they've experienced is something that they can use as an engine to empathize with other people in similar straits, and to the mutual benefit emotionally, that both of them end up feeling not alone. And this is the basis of peer counseling in addictions field, in mental health, and it is certainly the basis of empathy, which I think is the basis of peer counseling.
Mm-hmm. So, Dave, with the shame research, you're saying that you're glad that there is research into this, looking at how physicians are dealing with shame. It's just sort of that whole nature and there's different ways, it sounds, of addressing shame, and that the people that you talked to who became better at empathy, they were able to overcome like blocks to empathy. It sounded like the blocks of stress, the blocks of shame. I'm feeling shamed is sort of a block, and so there's a variety of blocks, and that it sounds like you're also valuing the peer counseling, which is people getting together and having peer-to-peer empathic listening, peer-to-peer sharing with each other. So if a physician is feeling shame, that they have people that they can, maybe other physicians, they can go to and share that, and kind of express it and kind of get it out, and not hold it all in, and all the negative consequences of having those things kind of bottled up and held in.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know if you're enough of your background to know what your contact with health professionals is. What's your sense of modern day health professionals from the interactions that either you've had or family members or friends have had?
Okay, so you'd like to shift a little bit to ask some questions about me, and I would say what's been my experience. I had some real serious pain, which was turned out to be gallstones. But I went to several physicians who were just hemming and hawing about it. I mean, it was just like, let's do more tests, let's do radiation, let's check the whole system. It's like, we don't know what it is. And one of them, I remember, came into the office and he says, well, what's the problem or something? It was just like, what's your problem? It was just unbelievable. I just could not believe the attitude that the doctor would say, as well as the sort of the hemming and hawing that was, we're not going to say what the problem is, but we need more tests. This was 3 different physicians, and these were the specialists. And so finally I went to the GP, or the internist, and I said, and my partner's a nurse too, so she's into who's the Harvard educated, who's the top in the field. And then they said, I'm near Berkeley, and said, it's over in San Francisco at UCSF, University of San Francisco Med Center. There's a guy over there. I went over there, he looked at the charts and everything, and within 5 minutes says, it's the gallbladder, got to come out. And it was just like clear, succinct, no more tests, this is the problem. I got lined up with just a really wonderful physician. There's a female physician who, they're all just very good, I guess, at least from what I saw, they're like physicians who kind of enjoy their work, and they're sort of they're curious and they're wanting to push the edge, and they write and do research and are very engaged in kind of the cutting edge. And so that was part of mine, was just that sort of curiosity, interest, versus people like, oh yeah, let's do more tests, and kind of not really it didn't have that same sense of engagement. So I was just wondering what you heard me say, if you could reflect back.
So what I heard you say is that you had an experience personally when you had abdominal pain that turned out to be gallbladder, but it baffled the first few physicians that you saw, and they seemed to not so much engage. They didn't engage with you. I'm reading between the lines when I hear that. They tended to want to rush to a test.
Yeah.
And one of them actually asked you, well, what's wrong with you, instead of saying, well, that's my job.
Yeah. I said, what the hell am I here for? It was in my head. I'm so sorry I didn't say it. It's like, I just felt like, I still have resentment against, I still want to lash back after all this time.
And you were frustrated until you spoke to your partner, who's a nurse, and she started to think, well, who's the best trained, who's the best experienced, where can you get? And we all rifled through our connections. Who do we know? And it drives me crazy when physicians are bothered by patients who look on the internet. Well, who wouldn't? If you're worried about your health, if you're not sure your physician knows all the best alternatives, or knows the go-to treatment, or knows the second line treatment when the go-to doesn't work, then of course you want to assist them. I think that's the definition of engagement. And I would want an engaged patient, but not everybody does, because there may be a number of reasons for that. We can speculate. Maybe it's because they are defensive. They're afraid they're going to be outdone, outpointed by the patient. Which I can understand. I don't agree with it. I can understand why they might feel threatened by that. But also some of them are burnt out. And I suspect that some of those physicians who give you short shrift, who sigh, who seem preoccupied with their own distress when they're talking to you, that's a very problematic frame of mind to be in when they're talking to a patient who has an acute illness. It doesn't work. They have to be tuned into you, because they have to be able to kind of help navigate through the terminology, because every patient brings their own unique terminology They don't all speak out of a textbook. They don't say I'm having right upper quadrant pain and doc, now that I mention it, my poop is clay colored and my urine is tea colored, like where you can go, great, straight out of a textbook. And so we have to get on the same page of understanding each other's words. But to do that, you have to like the person, you have to connect with them, you have to make the effort to connect with them. And sometimes, like maybe we expect patients to connect with us. Sometimes they're too ill to do that. And we have to take that into account because that's part of being in a doctor-patient relationship.
Okay, so you're really looking at the physicians that you're feeling that the physicians need to be able to connect with the patients, and some of them don't have an understanding of why patients are going out doing all this research on the internet, and are they feeling defensive, or are they feeling of being one-upped or something like that? So you would like, sounds like just physicians to have more empathy for the patients, and you understand, sounds like you have some understanding for the physicians also maybe feeling burned out, and the reasons why they wouldn't have that empathic capacity.
And Edwin, I'll just add to that studies have shown, and certainly surveys have shown, that as many as 40 to 50% of physicians in America right now are suffering from burnout to some greater or lesser extent. And I don't think it's all because of patients. I think it's because of the stresses that they're under, time pressure. I think a lot of it has to do with the corporatization of healthcare. That it's now much more about treating patients rapidly on an assembly line and watching the bottom line, making sure that you're not spending too much money on tests. I think that some physicians have been burnt out by the opioid crisis. I think it's a terrible tragedy, and it is something that has made some physicians fearful of patients. Fearful of patients who might be asking for opioids. These are patients with chronic pain, for instance, and I think in some cases it's because they haven't been able to deal with their own frustrations with the system, and they're taking it out on patients.
Mm-hmm. So you have some understanding for physicians and the stresses and strains they have with sort of a medical system that is causing stress through time pressure, corporatization, as well as just the whole opioid, I guess the sense of responsibility of maybe contributing to the opioid crisis that's happening. And I don't know if I'm sensing some sadness on your part. Are you feeling of sadness or grief in terms of that?
Oh, that's very perceptive of you. I feel great sadness about it, and the reason why I feel great sadness about it is that I played some role in the opioid crisis in Canada. I came to pain management. I had an office practice in pain management, and I came at it from the point of view as an expert on drug-seeking behavior. In the late 1980s, and I gave some speeches. I gave a lot of speeches. I wrote articles on the subject, and spoke to groups of health professionals of all kinds: physicians, nurses, dentists, law enforcement officers, pharmacists, and some part of the sadness that I feel is that. I would talk about the scams that were used by patients, and if it's criminal behavior, then they're just lying, and there are individuals who do that with entirely criminal intent, totally misrepresenting the purpose for coming into the office. It's to receive a prescription for an opioid that they can then sell to local drug dealers. But a lot of bona fide patients were afraid of being labeled or judged by their physician or by unfamiliar physicians in the emergency department or walk-in clinic, and so while I became an expert in that subject, and I gave a lot of celebrated lectures at the American College of Emergency Physicians and and other organizations in Canada, I look back on that with some regret because I was stereotyping a lot of behavior of patients. And I thought I was making up for that in the days when I became a doctor who treated people with chronic pain. And I gave a lot of speeches that were paid for by Purdue Pharma in Canada. And Purdue Pharma, of course, is the maker of OxyContin. And I went into those, and those were educational events. They were certified by the College of Family Physicians of Canada and other scientific bodies for continuing education credits. They were done independently of the pharmaceutical company. We had nothing to do with the marketing campaign, but we know what happened. We gave our seminars and lectures, and I said to I warned the people, the family physicians that we taught, it was primarily primary care family physicians, to screen patients for addiction and not to prescribe to people who had strong risk factors for addiction. And if they had some risk factors, to monitor them carefully, to screen them for addiction, to do pill counts, to get urine drug testing, to do opioid contracts. And the problem is that a lot of primary care physicians didn't get those messages. What they received was the message that opioids were a panacea for people with chronic pain. And we know what happened. The opioid crisis, I don't believe that it was caused entirely by physician prescribing behavior, but certainly physician prescribing behavior was a big part of it. And I was certainly one of the physicians who said that properly, with proper precautions, that it was safe to prescribe opioids to people with chronic non-cancer pain, and it clearly was not as safe, not nearly as safe as we thought. I can tell you that today I think that right now the key opinion leaders on this subject, the people who have framed the discussion, have blamed physicians who prescribe opioids entirely. My understanding of the nature of addiction is that having an external person to blame is not conducive to entering recovery, and that there have to be other reasons why so many people use opioids other than simply the fact that physicians prescribe. Here, take it; it's harmless. And that takes us back to societal issues like stress. But I cannot deny or ignore the role that I played. And it was only in being a physician who evaluated the practices of other physicians for the equivalent of the state medical board in Canada. They're called the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the provincial colleges. And frankly, I was appalled by some of the prescribing habits of physicians in walk-in clinics, for instance, prescribing large quantities of OxyContin, and in some cases ignoring the fact that the patient had received a 3-month supply of OxyContin a month ago, and came in saying that they'd lost the prescription, or furnishing some kind of excuse, or saying they were going away for 6 months. Can they get an early renewal on their prescription, without a hint of suspicion on the part of the physician? So I feel not only sad about that, I feel a strong sense of shame about that. And one of the ways that I deal with that shame is by talking about it openly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a very complicated situation. What I'm hearing there is with the opioid addiction crisis, and that you feel it's like a sense of responsibility, partial responsibility for your contribution to it. And it's very complicated, and there's a lot of different factors with it. And it sounds like when you first started with the drug, with talking about the opioids, you had a sort of a skeptical approach towards the patients, like, they're kind of looking at how they might be ginning the system, how they might be manipulating the system. And so then you kind of went to sort of a different way, saying, well, opioids are okay if used within the right context, but then not everybody's, all the physicians weren't hearing the full context that you're talking about. So it sounds like a very complicated situation, but that you feel like you did have a role in it. And so there's a sense of responsibility for that, as well as a sense of sadness for the, I guess, for the pain and the grief that maybe is generated from this, and their families, and the whole ripple effect of their personal lives, and kind of a real sadness and pain around that.
It's an absolute catastrophe, and it's an ongoing catastrophe, and I'm appalled to see that physicians, some physicians are continuing to be high prescribers of opioids even today, when, you know, I don't know if it's possible to unscramble an egg or put the genie back in the bottle. But you know, certainly there's a lot of evidence now to show that the first prescription by an emergency physician for an opioid in the emergency department, in the context of a patient with a headache or back pain, can set them on the road to addiction. So and that's something that we need to be keenly aware of.
Mm-hmm. So it's there is still, it sounds like you're concerned that the healthcare system, some physicians are still not really addressing this well or properly, or still prescribing. So it's still kind of keeping the problem going. It isn't really being addressed and solved. So the problem is still continuing, I guess, with new addicts being created through kind of still casual use of these opioids. Yes.
Or using them, believing, you know, having a bona fide chronic pain condition, believing that they are their only hope, their last hope, when in fact it's entirely possible that beyond the equivalent of 100 milligrams of morphine per day, that the opioid is actually increasing their pain, and that their better hope. We should never be speaking in terms of last hopes or better hopes when it comes to chronic pain, because people unfortunately have to live with it. But that their best option may be something called deprescribing, slowly, very slowly tapering the opioid over months and even over a year or two. And that can have some very strong benefits. And certainly, you know, colleagues that I've worked with, Dr. Andrea Furlan at University Health Network, Toronto Western Hospital in Toronto, is one of the experts, one of the world experts on deprescribing. It's literally called deprescribing. So you know, one of the ways that I can pay it forward is to talk about the challenging, you know, the challenging relationships between pharma and physicians, and particularly when it comes to the insidious influence of key opinion leaders, of pharmaceutical companies on key opinion leaders, and I certainly haven't done that for years, and I wouldn't do it today, and I wouldn't recommend it. It's not something that you know, it's a pervasive practice that used to be considered normal, just normal way of doing business, that pharmaceutical companies would recruit experts who were high prescribers of their products, who were people who were well-spoken, who were considered knowledgeable, perhaps researchers in the area, and they would pay them to give seminars, and now that practice is being phased out, not fast enough, and it's not just opioids, it's cholesterol-lowering drugs, it's blood pressure pills, antibiotics, chemotherapy, medical devices, and so by talking about my role in it in the past, one of the things I'm able to do is pay it forward by deconstructing it, and by saying that you know, how easy it is for physicians to give a biased message to physicians because of the company, the entity that's writing the checks. The other thing that I can do is promote and talk about better ways of dealing with chronic pain. Deprescribing is one of them. Non-opioid treatments is another as well.
Okay, so you see how you contributed to the opioid crisis, and you feel that the way forward for you to really contribute is to be open about the issues, really transparent about what's really happening, because when you can be transparent and open, then you can really address the issues, and that's sort of part of the shame. It's like, let's get past the shame so these issues aren't hidden and having all the negative effects that they have. But you want to contribute to sort of opening that up, talking about the issues that physicians face, the dynamics with the healthcare, the whole healthcare industry, and really try to have openness and transparency. And I guess that was sort of part of the empathy. It's like the empathy is sort of a way that you empathize with people instead of shame them, that you create a sort of an empathic culture and environment instead of a closed, indifferent environment. And so it's sort of maybe sort of like your way of, is it your way of contributing? And
I think that's a fair way of putting it. It's exactly the same when it comes to talking about my own medical mistakes. I did a TED Talk, and I did that to deal with my own sense of shame, and I've been gratified to discover that it's a way of connecting with other healthcare professionals who've made mistakes, who haven't felt as if they could share it with anybody, but they saw my TED Talk, and it's called Doctors Make Mistakes. Can we talk about that? And they found that they have been able to be unburdened because they've watched my talk. They felt that, if I could talk about my mistakes, then they can talk about theirs. And as soon as you talk about what it is that shames you, you cut it down to size. And when you do that, you're not overwhelmed by it. And maybe you can shift it back from shame to guilt. You can walk it back to guilt. And, the difference between shame and guilt is that, with shame, I am bad. With guilt, I did bad. When you do bad, you can repair it. You can, sometimes you can't repair it to the patient that you harmed, but you can pay it forward and you can apologize. And I found that patients are infinitely forgiving, in a way that I think a lot of health professionals have underestimated. And I think in many cases, patients just want to know what happened when it comes to a medical mistake. They're not looking for revenge. They just want to know what happened. And they have a kind of a suspicion, spidey sense that they're not hearing the full truth. And when they hear it, there's a sense of, aha, okay, now we can move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that there's this shame that goes on, and if you can share yourself, what you went through, your own personal experience, which you've done in your TED Talk, then other physicians, you sort of shown the way for them, that they don't feel, that you sort of broken the ice, opened this up, and then they feel more open since somebody else sort of was a pioneer in being open with this, and that sort of opens the gateway to working with reality, and it actually helps. Just what I'm hearing is to have an open sharing of what really happened, that patients really appreciate that if they feel there's a wall, something is hidden, that they feel suspicious, and all kinds of stuff, negative can happen from there. But if you're open and transparent, that just that openness and transparency is what they're looking for, and they have a sense of acceptance of that, and they can understand that some mistakes might happen, or they just understand. Yeah, they have, I guess, maybe a sense of connection and understanding. Yep. With the physicians and what happened.
And I can go back to being kind.
Mm-hmm.
I can go back to my better nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that most patients just want honesty. Some are preoccupied. Some of them want protection. Some of them are they seem to need everything to go a certain way. Everything has to go well, and they don't have that flexibility to accept the idea that Well, the idea of uncertainty in medicine, which is probably the dominant thing, the thing that we almost never talk about, but it's the most important thing. There's a lot of uncertainty in diagnosis, as you discovered, in treatment, and I sometimes I find that when people are particularly stressed out, they need certainty, but they can only get reality. They can only get what level of certainty is available. If you step in front of a truck on a freeway, a truck traveling at 60 or 70 miles an hour, you're probably going to die. That's about as certain as it gets. But we can't guarantee results in healthcare, and so one of the things about empathy is that the patient who is often challenging is a prickly, an anxious patient who's preoccupied with their own distress. If I can give them the space, acknowledge their distress, and give them the space to be distressed, then maybe we can communicate. And we may not agree with each other. They may decide that they want a more competent physician than I, but at least we've reached that. And sometimes I'll speak the unspeakable. The unspeakable meaning, it sounds like you're saying you wish you had a smarter physician here right now. And sometimes it's the elephant in the room. When you talk the elephant in the room, you actually give it a name, give it dimension. The patient laughs. And so where do we go from here? Okay, I'll search the internet. Maybe I'll get some expert advice. I'm going to go out and I'm going to look up some stuff, and I'll come back and talk to you.
So you're really speaking to those patients that want total certainty, and you're trying to say that the reality is that there is not this certainty, and that the way you can address the person that's just so fixated on that certainty is to try to empathize with them and hear what it is how they're feeling. And it could be just their stresses, that they have deep stresses, that they just need to be heard about it. And they might be thinking, hey, I need a different physician who's better than this one. And then if you can just feel that, see it, and just name it, that can sort of break the ice there too, and kind of get through that, and you can kind of find that connection with them, and maybe they will leave, but you're kind of dealing in a realm of reality, more of a reality of how things are, versus maybe these walls and stuff that could be there and kind of inhibit effectiveness.
Yep. And in the shame-based world, I would be defensive at those questions. Well, can you get somebody here who knows more than you do? And I'm not, and to be able to reach that point, now we're moving from empathy 101 to empathy 201 when it comes to healthcare, and it's not verbal. This is beyond verbal judo. This is not verbal judo. This is not fending off insults. This is actually reaching a deeper understanding with a patient or a human being. When I call him a patient, it's like I'm condescending with a fellow human being who may be greatly troubled by a major upset in their lives. I don't know anybody who isn't profoundly upset by a change in their health of themselves or someone they love or care about. And one of the things about, when we get older as physicians and we go through our own illnesses or the illnesses of our parents, we begin to see, the depth and breadth of how your life can be turned completely upside down by a sudden illness, and being able to reach a meeting of minds, and maybe even better, a meeting of hearts, can be a very powerful thing, not just for me helping the patient, but also reaffirming, validating myself as a fellow human being and as a physician who can be there for them, even if I can't cure them.
Mm-hmm. So just creating that deeper sense of connection, kind of the empathy 2.0 that you're saying, because you're able to handle sort of a criticism, like, hey, you're not good enough, I want a better physician. do you have the resilience and the capacity to say, oh, yeah, I really hear that, and you're really wanting somebody who's better, and you're not taking it personal, you're not worried about it, you're not trying to defend yourself, you just have the resilience and the capacity to hear that person, understand that they're going through a really traumatic experience, and to have the space and the capacity for hearing that and being with them as a human being, and not condescending as a patient. That it's just human beings connecting with each other, and kind of really try to foster that deeper connection.
Mm.
Okay. Is there more, or do you feel heard?
I feel heard.
Yeah. Okay, how was that for you? I was trying to do the empathic listening. I was just wondering how that worked for you.
That it was an interesting experience because it was different from the book interviews that I've had, where they tend to follow a fairly predictable script, a fairly predictable voyage of discovery that is very new the first few times you do it, and is a little bit more predictable, not stale, but a little bit more predictable as time goes by. And I would say a little bit more superficial than the conversation that we've had. I would say that I've been heard. In the world of that kind of shame-based attitude, I never know how I'm going to be treated, and I'm not looking for affirmations. But that's an uncertainty. Just as patients have uncertainties about diagnosis, I have uncertainty of how I will be treated. And I began my TED Talk by saying, I don't know what you're going to think of me at the end of this. And I never do, because, in that TED Talk, I got a standing ovation at the end of it, which was lovely. But I told a very similar story to a group of senior medical students at a very prestigious university in the United States. And I said, what do you think at the end of that? And one of them piped up within half a second, well, I think you're a shitty doctor.
Oh, dear.
And don't think that hasn't stuck with me.
So what I'm hearing is, when you're open and transparent like that, you're putting yourself out there, and you don't know what the reaction will be. Will it be supportive? Will it be understanding? Or will it be judgmental? And so you could be opening yourself for some real judgment. And so sounds like you have some curiosity of how your sharing lands with the other person. Is it?
I have curiosity, but I actually should not need to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay, then I'll say that thank you for being willing to try the empathic listening approach. I wanted to kind of shift from a normal interview where you just kind of ask the questions to, since we're talking about empathy, really model empathic listening. And this is sort of the core of, any, if it's, be it peer-to-peer, or even I don't like to use the word therapeutic, but it's just listening to someone and following them wherever they want to go.
Yes.
And that's what I was, so I wanted to sort of model that, besides just kind of asking questions. So thanks for being willing to jump into that. And
it was my pleasure. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to make sure one thing really clear. When we teach confiding in a colleague about a medical mistake, Brene Brown would say, you want someone to say, you're still okay, mm-hmm. at the end of that. But to be brave enough to talk about the things that you're ashamed of, you have to be willing to risk the possibility that people will judge you. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's because if you're just cruising for approval, then that's kind of not the point, because at some point somebody has to start the conversation by not fearing how they're going to be regarded. And what that means is that that's how I get past my feelings and get into a frame where I can empathize with others.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I'm interested in, is really how do we create a culture of empathy? So it's when you're talking about the opioid crisis, there's a whole spectrum of lack of empathy that people are dealing with in the culture itself. Like, you're saying, why do people have the addiction? There's, if you see, Gabor Mate, et cetera, talking about the lack of connection and people self-medicating, and just the full spectrum of, empathically listening with you, kind of doing a mutual empathic listening. I shared a little bit and you reflected back, but then you shifted into sharing. So I just followed with your sharing again. But it's bringing us into a mutually peer-to-peer empathic listening. So for me, it would be taking the patients, before they even went to the hospital, in their family, they would have had empathic listening. That there would be, that their family would have had a whole series of empathy circles. And I've done it in my family as well. That, the family sits and we do mutual empathic listening. And it's around conflicts or difficult issues. And so the patients would have a series of empathy, listening, empathic environment. The physicians would have a community of that on a regular basis. And it's so in a sort of a three-dimensional direction, in all directions, we're building a culture that is open and empathic. And we're not waiting for this moment of an illness for the empathy, then suddenly there's supposed to be empathy there. We needed to have empathy way upstream before we even got to that moment, as well as downstream as well. Like that the patients, when they get home, that they have empathic, listening and support to be able to share and be open. And so anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from around.
Isn't that interesting? And I think it's a worthwhile goal. And I think that I think that you're trying to work on this, as I'm hearing you, on an interpersonal level, a very deeply interpersonal level, and by getting people to practice what it's like to relate to others and to create empathy circles, so that you're building relationship by relationship a culture of empathy. I think one of the things that I'm certainly interested in interpersonal relationships and factors that foster empathy. I'm also interested in the systemic factors that allow empathy to flourish, and the ones that tend to get in the way of empathy, and certainly stress and time pressure, and perhaps a little bit about electronic, gadgets and social media that take people away from face-to-face communications. That those are factors that get in the way of empathy. So I'm interested in those as well. So
yeah, we're right there together, because it is the social structures hinder or foster empathy. If we have a justice system that's based on, competition to get to the truth, it's based on external judgment, it's based on retribution, it's not a very empathic building environment. And I'm not as familiar with the healthcare system, but I can see that, it's the system itself, the whole structure is, it's not geared towards supporting with effortlessly an empathic environment. You hear like Cleveland Clinic doing their empathy and innovation, conference that they do, that they're trying to use empathic design to follow the user experience, through the system. I don't know how well they're doing, but I have heard of them trying to sort of redesign the healthcare system. But the whole system, pretty much, the political system being a competitive us versus them system from the top down, it's not supporting empathy. For me, we're trying to build an empathy movement where we go to these rallies where there's a political left, political right. They're like screaming and yelling at each other, and we offer empathic listening to both sides and offer mediation between the sides. So, we're advocating for this culture of empathy, sort of a total cultural transformation of the whole system to be geared towards nurturing and fostering empathy systematically and interpersonally too. I think that's what it takes. It's like half-hearted measures kind of just get lost in the overall system, kind of beats them down.
And that us and them certainly fits into the script of the debates over immigration and refugees these days. Where we get this idea, and unfortunately we do tend to kind of like a pendulum swing back and forth between immigrants are us, refugees are us, which we all are. We're all people who arrived from other countries, unless we're Indigenous people, and we have a very strong Indigenous culture in Canada that feels left out of the modern Canadian state, and a system that subjugated Indigenous people and just wants them reconciliation means, just get over it. Whereas to Indigenous people, reconciliation means, seeing us as equals, seeing us as having, having a proud history and a proud language and culture, and honoring that, and that we have things to say about preserving the environment and about using resources in a way that respects and protects the environment, and yet the competing vision is the us versus them, that the settler, the people who've been living here for generations, are somehow that we're the us and the them are the Indigenous people, or in the case of immigrants and refugees, they're the them that are going to threaten our existence, and these are just frames of mind. I'm struck by the fact that humans and orangutans share 97.5% of the same genome. So if we have that much in common with orangutans, just think of how much we have in common with every human being on the planet. So I'm with you there. It's not just in the political system, but it's in
throughout the culture, the us versus them. We started our empathy tent at Occupy Wall Street here in Berkeley, and the Occupy Wall Street was us against the 1%. And again, it's still an us versus them. And I thought, no, this is not. As soon as you set up us and them game, it's like anybody can be put into that 1%. You can chop off the heads of the 1%. And then there's the next 1%. So we went with the empathy tent, and it said 100% empathy. So we've been advocating, since then for 100% empathy for everyone. And so it's really the means is that dialogue, so and there's people who don't want to talk. And so I'm all for using nonviolent means to bring people to the table. But the first thing is are the Indigenous and the settlers willing to dialogue with each other? And if not, then we need to use means to bring them to the table. And ultimately, it's just that dialogue and having the means and the tools for holding an effective dialogue, because so much of dialogue just devolves into, just people not having the tools for effectively holding those dialogues. And so that's what we're trying to support, is with empathic listening, where, it's some basic tools out of mediation, where one person speaks, the other person reflects back their understanding until that person feels heard. Then it's the other person, so we kind of do turn taking. It's that peer-to-peer approach, which you'd mentioned previously. So that's kind of like the core practice that we do, and it can be deepened into having deeper awareness of felt experience. Like, I made a guess about your feeling of sadness, which I could kind of sense a little bit of sadness, and I had some guesses too that maybe you're feeling angry or upset about the way things are. I didn't share that guess, but See, it could be a wrong guess too. That's possible too. And so there's a lot of tools to kind of deepen that empathic listening too, and that's kind of stuff that we're doing, and really try to get a movement, because it's going to take the communities who support empathy to get together. And like you're saying, sometimes the empathy community is not like the most supportive, the experts. I don't know if you saw the thing with Tanya Singer in Germany, just that I don't know if you know about her research. She's like supposedly this top empathy expert, and she was just put on sabbatical for kind of browbeating her employees, and they had 6, of the staff and PhD students, complaining that she's, kind of heavy-handed bullying them. So there's kind of all that kind of issue. Saying you're an expert's not necessarily being an expert. That studying it doesn't make you an expert in doing.
Well, I've gotta grab some dinner.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got to and I've got to connect with my children because we're coming up on 9 p.m.
Okay. Let you go then.
But I found the conversation interesting, and I'd love to see what you're going to do with this conversation.
Yeah, we'll upload it to YouTube and Facebook, so it'll be there, and I'll let you know when it's up online. A couple days.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Hey, take care, Edwin, and good luck with the empathy movement. I'm certainly with you on that subject.